you may as well start with a live stream of the event. So hello everyone, thank you very much for joining us today. I am very happy to see you all, and thank you to all the technical team that is supporting us. Hello to everyone that is joining us as an attendee in this webinar. Everyone will speak in English in this roundtable, but in case French works better for you, there is interpretation available. On the bottom of your screen, you'll see an icon with a globe. Click on it, choose French, and then you can hear us speaking French all of a sudden. Lucky you, because my French is not good normally. So my name is Katerina Anastasiou, and I'm a facilitator in Transform Europe. Transform Europe is a political foundation and network associated with the European Left Party and the left in the European Parliament. Today, together with my colleague Axel Ruppert, who is going to take the floor in a few moments, we're hosting this discussion with the title, How is Security Debated Within Europe's Left and Progressive Forces? Considerations for a New Concept of Security. Axel and I have been working on this quite some time together. This year, we hosted a series of webinars where we try to discuss the term security, how it is politicized, how it is understood, how does it work as a tool for in order to put place very restrictive and oppressive politics. And we try to have this discussion in the intersectional way, meaning we got people from different movements and people from left parties, but also researchers together, and we discussed about all that stuff in 5 consecutive workshops. Today, we want, together with some of our participants in these workshops, to have a deeper discussion on security. As the COVID-19 pandemic shows, there are emergencies that the current system is not able to respond to. And actually, the actual security needs of everyday life are far from fulfilled in the current situation. On the contrary, the security politics of today predominantly are used for policing, oppression, surveillance, but also for militarizing the border, accelerating the military industry, and so on. So we want to exit that logic and try to think together how the left should talk about security, what would be a left concept of security, and how do we actually find the convergences between movements and left parties in order to work together for a safer and peaceful future for everyone. That is, of course, that in our view, at least, has to be feminist, ecological, and fair. Today, it's also the International Day Against Violence on Women. So there is a double reason to have the discussion, because frequently, on the contrary to the let's say the predominant narrative of what an actual security threat is, for a lot of women, particularly now in many countries in lockdown, even their own home is not a safe space. So we have seen through this series of webinars I tried to describe before that there are concrete opportunities for left actors to join forces transnationally, but in some way also transdisciplinary. And that we know, all of us actually know, that struggles do intersect, and that the process of connecting them per se is a peace building process. So I will pass now to Axel, who will give us a couple of concrete examples that we were able to crystallize out of our workshop series. Axel, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Katerina. Thank you very much for the introduction. And as Katerina mentioned, I am working as project manager at the Brussels office of the Rosa Luxembourg Stiftung. And yeah, I had the pleasure to organize together with Katerina a couple of workshops on the topic of tonight. And yeah, today we also want to take the opportunity and look back at our previous 5 workshops and take also a look at the synergies that we've seen by discussing security through the perspective of peace movements, and discussing the aspect of militarization and military intervention, but also looking at the ecology and the climate crisis, looking at security from an anti-racist perspective, and looking at security from perspective of surveillance, digital and privacy rights. And looking back at these workshops, we concluded that there are actually quite many opportunities for synergies and for movements and actors to join together. Some of the most obvious, just like to name also as a kickoff for our debate that we might relate to later on. So one that we see very clearly is that peace movements that demand the defunding of the military and the military industry, and also the dismantlement of supranational military institutions, can do and should work together with social movements and unions demanding redistribution of wealth, social security, and strengthening of public sectors, including the health sector. So clearly linking the defunding of the arms industry and of the militaries with investment and spending in the public sector and on social services. Another aspect is environmental activists demanding action to stop, prevent the climate crisis, also demand systemic change of our economies. And when we look at the fossil fuel supply endeavors of the European Union and the development of Fortress Europe, we see that opposing the use and extraction of fossil fuels means to also protest against the arms industry and a militarized neocolonial foreign policy, which in our workshop series became very much evident when looking at the EastMed gas pipeline and gas extraction in the Mediterranean. Another aspect is looking at migrant and refugee solidarity movements who very well know the impact of the militarization of the EU and people. And they fight for the dismantlement of Frontex and defending human fundamental rights. So the nexus of these struggles to the struggles of peace and environmental justice movements is more than obvious, and more steps can and should be made towards synergy in these actions. Then finally, we also have the impression that those who step up for data protection, privacy rights, and who speak up against state and corporate surveillance share a lot with those advocating for the rights of ethnic and religious minorities who are more often than not worst affected by the undermining of fundamental rights. At the same time, we see that the technology that makes surveillance at this scale possible is often provided by the very same security and arms companies that peace movements are mobilizing against. So these aspects are some of the examples that became very obvious during our workshops, and that we see for points of convergence that we like to work further on. Before I now hand over to Katerina, who will start our roundtable, also the hint to our attendees that you are most welcome to use the Q&A box, which you can see in the Zoom taskbar below, to also start typing in your question while we're still discussing. We'll open the floor, but Katerina will say more on that. We'll open the floor for questions from you later on, but please feel free to already start writing questions in the Q&A box that will be sorted and taken on later on. And please use the Q&A box for that and not the chat. So handing over to Katerina.
Thank you very much, Axel. I'm fighting a little bit with my computer. Just give me 1 second, everyone. Thanks. So I have the honor now to introduce our discussants today. As I told you before, we will try to do a less formal format. So I'm very happy to introduce 5 people with whom we've worked in the past and are brilliant, everyone in their own way. So today we have with us Heidi Meinzolt, chair of the European Board of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the oldest peace movement, feminist peace movement organization. Walter Baier, a member of Transform Europe, the long political director of Transform and economist. David Pereji, I hope I pronounced it right, from the Podemos International Secretariat, who has joined us throughout this difficult, or actually very interesting workshops the past 6 months. Sara Rida, an activist and an organizer, campaigner for the organization Agir pour la Paix, but also a very active political European woman. That I'm happy to know also personally. And of course, last but not least, Angelika Adensamer, a researcher, a criminology researcher, and at the same time, an activist of a new founded party in Vienna, Links. So welcome to all of you. Just before we kick off, I would like to briefly describe how it's going to go again today. Axel will actually ask a question, and then we will ask all of you to give an answer. And from that moment on, after the first question, we will try to enter a flow where we exchange the floor between us in a more, not such a strict way. So to all of you speakers, if you feel you have something to share at a particular moment, any moment, show your hand, and we're gonna give you the floor. And I would now pass to Axel to more or less put the elephant inside the room.
Yes, thank you. Before I do that, also, yeah, for our speakers, if you feel that you would like to relate to a statement that was made previously, please indicate that, and we are very much open to accommodate that. And as Katerina said, not follow a strict order, but yeah, you're very much welcome to interact and to react to the statements made by the others in this round as well. Yes, Katerina said, one central question that, well, we obviously had in mind when we started a series of workshops, and which is still with us, is the question of what we from the left actually make out of the term security, which dictates much of today's policies and politics and is hegemonized by the right and conservative forces. It's at the center of our debate, but at the same time, it's also contested among the left whether we should actually take it up. So there is the term that the more you talk about security, the more insecure people will feel. And this is obviously a discourse that we do not want to contribute to, and we want to prevent from falling into this logic. At the same time, we decided to start this debate because we think it's crucial that we from the left address this topic and cover it. But we'll be very much interested in putting this out there as our first question. From your perspective, why is the discussion about security at the moment important for left and progressive actors? And how do we ensure to not contribute to the current security discourse that I just described, but to frame one which is in our interest and adheres to our values? So this is the first question. I'd like to ask Heidi.
Okay, thank you. And I already enjoyed one meeting with you, and I think security is really a big elephant, because in most of the cases, it's very quickly linked to a kind of consensus of people saying, yeah, we have to avoid conflict, we have to invest in conflict prevention. But when it fails, and then the whole debate starts about how to react in case when prevention fails. And one of the first points where we always land is that not knowing what to do in a kind of in a difficult crisis, then easily we go back to weapons. This is the wrong debate, where we end up always in a militaristic discussion. And but on the other side, we have to see that security is an existential moment in the life of human beings, and especially in, this is of course the today's discussion on violence against women, that the security is to, our security is to be free of violence and aggression. And this is a moment where, for example, the women of Will, my organization, already more than 100 years ago, they analyzed the root causes of violence and war. And they were immediately at the point that women can never be protected in war or in conflict. So it's, on the one side, it's protection, but security is also, and this is all around the UN Council Resolution 1325, and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, is also that we have the right to participate meaningfully in all decision makings. And if we don't see this triangle on the one side, on the other side, the analysis of root causes, which are always connected from patriarchy to militarism and also economic profits. These are the elements which have to come together, and starting from what we all feel, more also emotionally, when we are insecure or when we are secure. This justifies, of course, also a political debate on security. This would be my first point.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Walter, would you take the floor now?
Yes. First of all, I want to remind of a survey which was executed by Spas Marx a couple of years ago after the presidential elections in France. The question was, is there a distinction possible between the voters of Jean-Marie Le Pen and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, both of them being called populists? And that what Spas Marx found out was, yes, there is a clear-cut cleavage between these two electorates, not only as they interpret themselves as being leftists and rightists, but also in terms of which topics were the decisive ones for the electoral choice they have done. And interestingly, for the people who voted for Mélenchon, the main issue was healthcare and ecological sustainability, while for the voters of Jean-Marie Le Pen, the main motive was security and migration. And I find this as an interesting starting point for our debate. It's definitely meritorious of the seminar in which we participate that you remind us of that the basic right of providing material, social, cultural, ecological conditions for a dignified life. This is also the basis for what we should denote as security. And I would say that in times of a capitalist crisis, the wide spread of feeling insecure is perfectly understandable. However, and this is my first point, security as a term to address these feelings of not feeling safety, of being afraid of the future, is nothing else than a by-proxy term for nationalism. In every detail, the grammar of the security discourse reproduces the grammar of nationalism. It's our way of living which is allegedly threatened. It are our borders which must be defended. It's our system of liberal democracy of which military defense we have to sacrifice more money. And it are our wars in which we have to send our troops to Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and who knows where else. So the question then is, can we delink the term security from the hegemonic discourse and integrated it in an opposing one? I think no yes or no answer exists to this question, primarily because it is not an intellectual exercise, but a matter of practice, a matter of power, if you wish so. And I'm very serious about this. Overcoming nationalism or the security discourse in the first place is a matter of social struggles and the experience of social struggles in the broad sense understood as solidaristic, feminist, ecological, and migrant struggles, with the potential of turning the political agenda upside down and thus polarizing the forces along new social and political cleavages, resulting in the downgrading of what in the hegemonic discourse is referred to as security. And that is the message which I draw from the survey of Espace Marx about the voters of Le Pen and of Mélenchon. And to add a last point to this introducing statement, I believe that on the other hand, each and every strive for social, gender, and ecological justice, which in a social or, if you like, in a class perspective, is seen as fights for interests, rights, and dignity, became meaningless if it was not connected with the struggle for peace and disarmament. And in this sense, deconstructing the myth of that security would be a matter of military buildup and not of social and ecological changes is not a kind of diversion from the real struggles, but a complement of them and even a necessary element of politicizing them.
Thank you very much, Walter, for putting things in a very good perspective, in a political frame, of course. I would like to pass the floor to Sarah.
Hi, thanks everyone. I think when we're talking about security, we can actually just look at whose lives are considered disposable in society and whose rights are protected, and what is the political and economic system that's, keeping that in place. I think it's really important to talk about how, Western European, our economy is built on a history of colonialism, slavery, mass displacement, and ecological destruction. And this is continuing today, with a very racist and classist border and prison industrial complexes defining European EU policy, with the land grabbing and murder and erasure of indigenous communities that underpins our industrial model of agriculture, and the fossil fuel extractivism that we see in places like Latin America, for example. We have an economic system that's dependent on precarious and unregulated labour, and we have conflicts happening in places like Yemen and Palestine that are being fueled by European weapons. So I think when we talk about security, we need to be talking about how the arms industry and the militarization of society is basically keeping this system of colonial capitalism in place. And it's protecting those who profit from the system, big business and elites. I think, I've been working on these issues for about 10 years, and none of what I've just said is new. But I think what we've seen in the last 8 months is suddenly it becoming obvious in a very real and devastating way whose lives are considered disposable in society. and how actually years of, neoliberal austerity politics and the decimation of public healthcare systems suddenly meant the loss of lives that shouldn't have been lost. And the arms industry felt this, as soon as the pandemic hit, Western Europe, there were articles appearing in the European press saying how, yes, there's a pandemic, but now is not the time to cut back on defense spending. And saying that actually the arms industry could be really good for fighting pandemics. And this is the same thing we've heard with the arms industry's usefulness in tackling climate change, migration, civil unrest, whatever issue you have. The way that the arms industry and therefore the EU defines security is, identifying threats and how we need to increase military spending to protect us from these threats. And I think we can't talk about security without talking about corporate power and who is defining the narrative. I live in Brussels and I'm about 10 minutes away from the European Quarter, where over 25,000 lobbyists, 3/4 of whom represent corporate interests, have a very close relationship to EU decision makers. And it's not a coincidence that conversations on security are dominated by the arms companies that are going to profit from the militarization of borders, prisons, all of these private security systems that are in place, or that any legislation attempting to tackle climate change or our toxic food system is being delayed or sabotaged by the fossil fuel industry and big agribusiness companies. So I was really happy that with the workshop series that you framed it as an intersectional systemic issue, because I think we can't talk about security without looking at the big picture and what is the system that we've got in place and how do we tackle it.
Thank you very much, Sarah. You have fans in the chat. David, the floor is yours.
Hi, good evening for everybody. Thanks for the people who are gathering here. I think this is a very important issue, just discussing and also gathering. So we are living in a pandemic time, so it needs to be done by Zoom, but at least it's something like community. So we are together, and I think this is very important. So I think it's very important for left parties and organizations to talk about security, because we are living in a time of securitization. It's something like it's just continue growing from 2001. It's not just continue growing in Europe, especially with the terrorist attack, especially in Paris now 5 years ago. It recently happened also in Vienna. And we have to talk about security, because it's not just security, it's just securitization. It's something like they are turning all the social, economic, political problems into just military and police problems. They are turning large group of people into suspects, taking away rights that allow big areas of impunity. I know everybody can think in their own countries which kind of issue is. People with different origins, with people with different religions, even people that have to go to our countries to work. So this kind of no right zone, they are in Europe, in our countries. They are creating new borders also inside Europe. So they have encouraged economic exploitation, inequalities, and they are creating a very bad situation. No mind, wherever the border you are. Even you are inside some borders, you have the problems, because securitization is something like a process. It's not just security. It's not just military problems that Heidi was mentioning. It's something like they are considering that every aspect in the world, in the European Union, every people can consider an enemy. So we can consider an enemy for no matter what. So we need to talk about security, because we are living in this time of securitization, because we are living in a very difficult time. Of course, in our history in Europe and all over the world, we are living very difficult times. But now I have to remind you that we are living in a time that we don't know which is our future, what will be also our present, if we have basic commons, basic needs like labor, family, economic, political. we don't know about our future. So it's easy to people to be afraid. So we have, for one hand, big structural problems, and in the other hand, we are living in a time of that we need protection. But protection is not mean just security, and of course not means securitization. From our perspective, that we work from foreign policy, and we were very involved in these 5 years in some terrorist attacks, trying to have answers from left perspective, and also with foreign policy, because in this kind of securitization, the problem is always the people, not the structural, and they always forget that what Sarah was mentioning, that we will have surrendered by wars, surrendered by sexual violence, surrendered by a lot of people that they have to go from their countries and to have to start a very long way to enter Europe as migrants or refugees. So we have to be very, very, I think we have to be very, in the case to work when this kind of wars or terrorist attacks, they are not. So we need to improve our work in this kind of peace moments that they are not so common, but we need to improve some contributions for socialist movement, universities, political parties, trying to have something like a common aspect. I think they are very good to tackle the securitization framework, the right to a life with dignity, equality, social justice, sustainability, the lessons from feminism, from ecology, from the peace movement. So there are many valuable practices and criticism, reflection they have from this kind of issues. But we need more. We need more. If we look into the parliamentary actions, so we need to get something like a melange, to get something like a mix of everything, and to get something like a global, if we manage to do it, a global perspective that we need to serve in 2 purposes. The first one, demanding a long-term changes in the global model, that is not only us, because who is us? The securitization is asking about nobody's us, everybody, we are the 99%. We have to tackle the 1% that is also behind the securitization model. And the second one, trying to create a unified proposal in this short term that can add the demands of the social movements and the university and the think tanks. They can serve and tackle some goals in the parliamentary actions. And the last one, I think I would like to mention now. Please, we don't have to blame the reaction of the people that they are with us in Europe. We try to convince them, work with them, debating with them, and working with the people, trying to reorientate the framework. We have not to forget that we are the 99%, not in just Europe, just in the Maghreb, but in the Masrek, in Africa, in Asia, and all over the world. So we have to not to be divided, but the ones who were, I think Walter was mentioning, they were trying to draw a line between something like securitization means us, nationalism, extremism. Our continent has a long history of good things and bad things, and we don't have to repeat the horrors of our history, and we can manage to try to create an horizontal alliances.
Thank you very much, David. I want to say hello also to the people that are now joining us in the stream. Apparently the first 20 minutes, unfortunately, didn't go online. So hello, everyone that is through the stream here now. And Angelika, the floor is yours before we come back with a second question.
Thank you. A lot has been said already. I just want to say a few words about the security debate and different meanings of security. And I think, especially as progressives critical of that term and critical of the debates behind that, we have to be very careful of how and when we use that term. So basically that has already come up in different meanings. Just in that few statements before me, there's a sense that we also have for security that we think is good security. There's security in terms of real physical safety, in terms of peace, of ecological justice, of decolonization, and so on. And then on the other hand, there's a security that fuels emotions, fears, very racialized fears, nationalist fears, securitization, industrial interests, and so on. And I think it is hard, like it's not possible in every context to just claim the word security and make it our own. I think if we do that, we will have to be very sensitive towards what context we do that in, or have to be very clear in terms of what we're talking about. And I think it really, that debate in my experience is, I mean, it's more in the field of police and domestic security, and in that sense, in terms of criminality. For me personally, it's really a sort of a minefield as a progressive, as a leftist, to talk about these issues, because sometimes you will be confronted with being against security, and then of course they term it in a good sense of security. So you are against protecting people, you are against protecting people from violence and so on, you're on the side of the offender. And of course you're not really that, you're just very critical of how social issues, social problems are handled by police, by more violence and so on. And then you try to criticize their security measures as not effective, or as not in line with fundamental rights and the rule of law, which are also aspects of security. And then it becomes a debate about how to do it better. So how to have a security, have now again in terms of law and order, how to fight criminality, how to police better. And maybe that's also not entirely the debate you want to have as a progressive, because you might have a critique of prison system in general, of the police in general, of certain criminal laws, of the war on drugs, of criminality of borders, and so on, and so on. So it kind of gets very easily mixed up. And I think it's, I mean, I'm not against debating any of these issues, but I think there is a lot of sensitivity to context and to making oneself understood in very clear terms in that in that sense. Like sometimes it's just the examples one uses, and they can very easily, I've made the experience of that being very easily turned around when you try use examples where you wouldn't need certain surveillance measures, and it's drugs and whatever, and they can always come back with the examples where you have a harder time arguing that you wouldn't want, I don't know, surveillance being used in terrorist attacks or more drastic examples in a way. So I think it's a good debate to have, how to use the term, and I think I just wanted to add to a lot of good things that have been said, that I think we have to be very careful and how to use it.
Okay, thank you very much, Angelika. I don't know, Axel, would you like to put the same next question on the table, or should I? I can also.
Yeah, but maybe before we do that, I already would like to ask our speakers if there's, if anybody, if you would like to react to one of the statements that was made.
I'll wait for the next question.
Okay, but Heidi, you raising your hand?
Just a little remark, because there's also the concept of the responsibility to protect, which was one of the examples after the genocide in Rwanda, where United Nations tried to find a way of taking security for the people or protection. But due to the logic that many, especially the mainstream politicians have, is the answer was immediately to, again, a militarized answer. So even some concepts of who were ready to give an answer to security threats, or in this case, it's I cannot speak about security threats because it was really a genocide. So even the answers are extremely difficult. And a second remark, we all see, if we are really committed into political action and analysis to combine this, that on the one side we need emotions to formulate also the suffering of people through economic threats, as well as environmental, as well as through militarized environments. But the dilemma is between letting these emotions on suffering go really into the debate, and both talk about fear. So this is something where even it might be even an ethic or a philosophical debate beyond political debate to go into these problems.
Go ahead, Sarah. Yes, I saw you.
Thanks. I was just thinking that it's quite easy when we're having these conversations to sort of stay at the rhetoric or get caught up in how we define something, and it's like, actually, now is the time to be talking about concrete action and what can happen. And I feel like, again, in the last year, it's been, depressing on a whole number of levels. But we've also seen real opportunities and the discourse changing. It's like following the huge Black Lives Matter protests, suddenly police abolition, which is something that people have been talking about for generations, becomes a reality that's talked about, with Minneapolis Council voting to abolish the police. Or, for example, in Halifax, in Canada, the council, instead of buying an armoured vehicle for the police, decided to invest that money in anti-racist and community building projects instead. We've seen Portugal, for example, regularising migrants during the time of the pandemic, so that they could access public services. And it's like, well, if they can do that during a pandemic, why can't they do that outside of Corona? And Spain, for example, trialling universal basic income for several 100,000 families. And I feel like now is the time to be talking about what does the different reality look like, and how do we make that happen? How do we build power to push for a different system? Coming back to the arms industry, for example, again, these conversations aren't new. We've been saying we need to transition away from military production towards socially and ecologically useful technology. And again, during Corona, we saw that happening with some arms companies being made to produce ventilators and hospital equipment instead. So I really think it's like, now's the time to think big.
Yes, David.
Yeah, I would like to add that it is very interesting that I think this is a very important debate about feelings and rationalism, and also our political approach, because it's very easy. It's a normal thing to feel afraid about something, a terrorist attack in your town, or even now in the time of the pandemic. It's something that is very usually common. Well, so common and frequently and always used by the political powers. I think I could always think in the Netanyahu approaches just to terrify their own population, that they are occupying a country, but they feel afraid because they have a horrible history about the Jewish history in Europe. Or I could also think about the terrorist attack now when it happens, so everybody feel afraid about the neighbor. Nobody knows. Even also about the time of pandemic, when you don't know what happened to your neighbor. So I think we have to politicize this feeling, but in the opposite, there are security enterprises, security companies, industrial military enterprises, just in the opposite way. So for us, it was very interesting to use the human security approach of the United Nations. So easily talks about even economics. We can translate it into Marx words or into Gramsci words with a different kind of approach, of course, a different kind of framework. But in the basis, they are talking about we need human security that is based in our life. So it's easily tackled when it is something like a peace moment. So it's easily, we need to do it in a peace building moment in our communities regarding to coexistence and integration with rights with people there with living us. We have to tackle to the foreign policy that is horrible, that is always based on interest, that is also based on and getting resources. But we have to tackle the feelings. They are people. We are people, and we need to regard and to gain something like is against neoliberalism moment that we are alone. So we have to create communities. We have to create to learn about the history of the trade unions 200 years ago, to the communist and socialist parties there. So they were very good in creating communities. It was easier at the time because the people has the same conditions. But in somehow, if we feel protected, if we feel we have a future, and if our future doesn't interfere with our neighbors, and this is very difficult because we are living in a country or in a continent that is also based in inequalities and sufferings of the other people in Maghreb and Masrek and Africa and others. I think we have something gained. So this is, for me, the mentality of 99%, and we have to try to adapt to the security issues. And it's very difficult, I know, it's very difficult.
Yes, Walter.
Yes, the more I think about it, the more I get the impression that the notion of security is a very toxic one. Why? Heidi rightly says there is a philosophical and a very subjective moment implied in this discussion. It's about fear, but logically speaking, the antithesis to fear is the freedom of fear, which I would say is a basic human right, which opens the path to a more rational discussion about what the reasons and the sources of fear actually generate, than a notion which, like it or not, is inseparable from state and state policies. And in my opinion, or in my interpretation, actually, this is the white elephant in the room. Security policy, in the stance of military policy and border control, is state policy. And this is the vanishing point. The states are first and foremost devices of the ruling classes to secure undisturbed capital reproduction. However, we are living in a period where capitalism undergoes a fast and unprecedented transformation, which indeed constitutes a threat to exactly this security of capital reproduction, and it raises the temptation of using violence in coping with it internally and externally. And what we see are not only increasingly confrontational policies with a higher degree of military risk, but also transformations of the states towards authoritarianism, even in the cases where the facade of a liberal democracy is still, so to say, alive or is alluded to, as we see it in France, however, also challenged by a far nationalist and a neo-fascist right. And I believe when we discuss on these issues between movements, political foundations, political parties, even NGOs, we must always have in mind that we are living in this very dangerous transitional period in which one of the most confrontational lines in which we are involved is the fight for defending liberal rights, individual rights, as well as collective rights against the idea which is connected with the myth that social problems in the first place could be settled by the use of violence. And I believe that this is very difficult to explain and to demonstrate if you, to a certain extent, adopt the discourse of security. No, it's about rights, it's about interest, it's about dignity, and it's about freedom.
Thank you very much, Walter, for this. I mean, I'm also thinking into the discussion now as well, but we still have something to answer though, because it is for a fact that this securitization is not only a marketing wording used by many of the elites. It's also something that has been legislated the last decades. Like even when Austria decided to stop asylum seekers from reaching the country, and this was already 2015-16 under a social democratic government, they actually justified this cap on asylum seekers with the protection of the sovereignty of the nation. This was the law, right? So on the other hand, you see young left activists and politicians when they do enter the political debate, and they have a journalist across them, and they come up with the ideas of defunding the police, investing in education, investing in anti-racist struggle, and so on. The question of the journalist would be, okay, so you're against security, right? And this is what we have to find out. What would be the answer to unmask this? Because being skeptical towards the military industry, the Frontex operations, NATO, and all these supranational military structures around the world is okay. But what do you answer when it is such a synonymous by now, the security and military industry with term security, that I do believe that we cannot come outside this vicious cycle of securitization if we don't address this. But perhaps some of you have thoughts on that as well, like going more a little bit in the praxis. Already in the introduction, Axel described some of the examples that are very, very obvious, like being against the arms industry or being a peace activist means that you also take the lives of migrants and refugees seriously. So you do have to have an interest on their lives as well, because the industry you're fighting is causing the war in their countries and they have to flee, right? There's also a similar question, by the way, in the Q&A. So I'd like to hear your takes on that. And I saw Angelika would like to take the floor.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly answer to that question. I think when we talk about very concrete legislation and very concrete surveillance and policing measures, we can talk about them concretely and don't have to talk about them in terms of security. So we can say what they do not do, who they affect, that they are not necessary, why we think that they violate fundamental rights and so on. And I think also in terms of other dangers, we can talk about them very concretely. We can say people need protection from war zones, and they need protection in camps, and they cannot live well, and they're in really absurd conditions. And we can say all these things without talking about security per se. And of course, we're sort of talking about this entire topic in a way, but in a more concrete way than just calling on a term that has so many emotions attached to it in a way. And I think this will work with people that are not so afraid maybe to think about it in a different way. It can help to actually sort of bring a different perspective, to bring a perspective of someone who is under surveillance, who needs protection, and so on. I think just describing situations like that can help in that way. But in the end, I think it is not a way necessarily, and not an answer to taking away that fear from people. And I think one of the, because it's a very strong feeling and not a very, as we've said, like I don't think it's I mean, I don't want to say it's an irrational feeling, because I don't think it is, but I think it's not something that you can just argue away with facts and numbers and different perspectives or so on. And I think one of the sort of problems there of the left is that they don't replace it by a different sort of fear. And of course we wouldn't do that. But I think that's why the progressive arguments are always a bit more abstract and always a bit more like further away and a bit less, I don't know, yeah, less strong emotionally than that particular fear in a way. And I think that's really something I've been thinking about a lot, and I feel like there's not, it's very hard to answer that. And I think it's one way, I think, to answer that is really not by debates as such, but by really changing, how to say, by making these experiences. I mean, that's also hard, because sometimes people are not affected at all by security measures. So they have a purely, they have an idea that they profit from that, they profit from the surveillance of others, they profit from the discrimination of others, without actually ever noticing a difference in their lives. So yeah, it's, I think it's, yeah, that part is difficult, but I think about a lot of things by talking about them very concretely. I think we will be getting further.
Yes, thank you very much, Angelika. I've seen Heidi and I've seen Sarah, and I think this is also an argument Sarah touched upon before. But yeah, giving the word to Heidi first, and then to Sarah. And I also want to encourage all our attendees. We have already questions in the Q&A box, and we will turn to them very shortly. So if you have any further questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A box, and we will address them in some minutes. So Heidi.
Taking up what Katerina mentioned with the questions to young activists, if they don't really take security serious, I think there are a lot of examples. If I remember all the discussion and trainings for the objectives of consciousness in the 70s and early on, with these stupid questions coming always back. What would you do if your brother is aggressed? Would you shoot, or would you take an arm, or and there are a lot of arguments and materials saying really sticking to a non-violent approach, and this is a training, and it's a long-term experience where we have to be in, and we have to finance these possibilities and fund these opportunities to get this training to resist also to all also commercial attractions and very short-term gains of yeah, I'm the first, and all these rhetorics around it. And I think this is really important. And on the other side, we have, as Angelika said, we really have to talk about shelters for all kind of people in difficulties. And it's for migrants, it's for poor people, and it's really creating shelters.
Yes, thank you, Heidi. Sarah.
Hi, thanks. I was just, yeah, I mean, I'm coming at this more as an activist and someone who trains and supports people to take action. And I feel like, you know, when we're talking about security and fear, it's like, whose fear and security are we talking about? You know, often we're talking about fear of conflict elsewhere, but it's like you look in our societies. I mean, I look at the countries that I've lived in Western Europe, and there are a lot of people who live in fear, who live at a very real threat of violence and death by the state institutions that are supposed to protect populations. And I think we can take it back to like what would actually save lives in the society we live in, and it's things like a functioning public health system, it's having affordable and accessible public housing, it's regularizing people who have no papers, proper labor rights, support for people who are unable to work or have disabilities or who live in precarious situations, and having a robust welfare state. And so for me, the question as movements is, how do we build the power to make these changes happen? Because we're not going to convince decision makers that they need to rethink security. Nothing has been won without a struggle. So for me, the question is, how do we build power in the left? How do we build mass movements that force a change? And I think something that Rosa Luxembourg organised this year as well, that was one of the most inspiring things I've been part of, was a international training led by the union organiser Jane McAlevey. And there were 4,000 people from 72 countries. It was interpreted into 6 languages, which in itself is incredible. But really it was like trying to stimulate this very practical how do we build, how do we transform society? And I think when, whether or not, I think action can change discourse, we can change narrative through what we do. And to be honest, I don't care if the decision makers keep talking about security in a militarized way, if actually what we're seeing is a transformation of society that we need to make happen.
Great, thanks a lot. David.
Thank you. I think regarding to the question that Katerina sent to us, I think it's very crucial, because I think more or less we can agree that we have something like in common, that in times of peace we can do peace building based on human security or whatever we call it. I think we are not in the same words, okay, because it's very difficult. But it's very difficult when you have to tackle violence actions. So I was thinking was Heidi was mentioning, because I remember perfectly the peace movement lesson about peace is not just oceans of no conflict. It's something more. So we are living in a structural problems. But when you are in the case, you have to answer that. So if this journalist around you, it depends on the moment. If you just suffer a terrorist attack, or there was a woman that was murdered by violence by machismo, you have to answer this reality. And it's something that this is a person that is suffering. At the same time, I think it's the same feeling that this is a person that is running away from a war, from Libya, from Syria, from Iraq, and they're trying to escape. So it's something like in common. I try to convince my people here and everywhere that it's something we have in common. So I can do depend on the moment. If there is something like a terrorist attack, I would say, okay, we need police action. So, but we need something more, survey or an investigation. That's something like taking out a neighborhood, tackling the people by their aspect. So this is something like it's something not effective. We work very hard here trying to say this is not an effective framework. Of course, it's unjust. It's very unjust, but it's also not effective. When there was the terrorist attack in Brussels, I was remembering, we would talk about there was something like a second-hand market of trade of weapons that they come from Western Balkans and other countries entering Brussels. There was a mess with the different kind of police there in Belgium. So it's something, if you are in the government or if you are in the opposition, you have to tackle. We need more efficiency, but efficiency is not just military or police. So if we are serious, we need more. Of course, we need police sometimes, but regarding to our law, regarding to human rights, regarding to international law, because we would like to live in the law. If we are poor, or if we are unequal, or if we are we need the law to protect us. So it's regards again to protection. So in somehow, if these questions are always tricky because they are demanding the right solution. Okay, more police, more army, more spending on military army, but we need to tackle. Now we are living in a very hard situation in Spain because we have a huge campaign saying squatting is a national problem. So there is a company that is profiting from selling alarms. So it's incredible because we are living a housing alert. So we have 3 million houses with no people, and we have a huge housing problem. So this is not the problem. But at the same time, if you are living in a popular neighborhood, I need the people to be safe. But saying, okay, this is not the main problem because there is something like 5 or 10 people that they stole the house of other people. The problem is we need housing. We need cheap housing. We need something like a public housing. This is a right for everybody to live with dignity. But at the same time, okay, if there is one case, we can send the judges, we can send the lawyers. We don't need private companies. But I think this is the point because it's very difficult when you are out on the wall. So you are out on the wall, and they are profiting of this kind of wall. So we need to avoid this kind of wall framework.
Thank you, David. I will take it from there. Walter, did I see correctly? You want to take the floor as well? No, not yet. Okay, just let me to pick it up from there, okay? And I will take it from Vienna, actually, where I live and some of us here are based. I mean, we did have enough laws or enough secret police to avoid this terrorist attack that happened some weeks ago. And in fact, even the Interpol had informed the Austrian police of the perpetrator already back in July. But within this, let's say, cascade of mistakes that happened, the answer to this, instead of looking at the secret police that has a lot of problems, super problematic, trying to find out why the juridical system didn't manage to help this young person because the perpetrator was only 20 years old and born in Austria. So instead of looking at this, the answer was an even more restrictive law, even more surveillance, and of course the direct targeting of the Muslim community in Austria. And this is something that we see already in France. The new law in France is absolutely crazy. You're not allowed to, I think you get a fine over 40,000 euros for filming a policeman that is being violent, which is crazy, no? So still, I mean, I do understand that putting focus in the alternatives, putting focus in the intersections of problems, but also struggles, trying to campaign together from different approaches, try to be inclusive in our approaches. I understand that this is very important, and it is already happening and sometimes very successfully as well. But still, there is the problem there. How do you do it? How do you explain this very complicated thing? I mean, just also 30 seconds more, maybe for the audience that is from other countries in Europe and doesn't know the story. But for example, this perpetrator, we have discussed it also in Vienna within activists. He grew up here and he was 20 years old. And like the question, how is it possible for a 20-year-old that grew up in Europe, that wants to pride itself for the freedom of press or whatever, although we know that all of these rights are always relevant, no, to power. But how is it possible? And this question is not being posed. And this anonymizes people and does not address the problem. So the question is how to deal with this, how to deal with this. Any of you would like to take the floor? Otherwise, I would propose that Angelina reads out 1 or 2 questions from the Q&A. Then we do again a round, if you don't disagree. And just to let everybody know that David has to leave us at 7:30. He has another meeting. So if it seems that he gets the floor a little bit more the next minutes, it's just because he has to go half an hour earlier, okay? So Angelina, would you like to read out some questions for us?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
So actually we have two questions that are quite similar, and it's surprisingly because they both come from different people. So the question is this: shouldn't the question we are discussing rather be how to address the root causes of the conflict and not the securitization of the conflict? Shouldn't the governments rather be investing in negotiating peace rather than providing business to the military industry? This is the first one. And the second one, there are more deaths at work than on the war front, according to the ILO, with an alienation and risk for workers and consumers, in particular to safeguard jobs and growth. What can the left and progressive responses be? What informed citizens' debates can we actually develop? Which culture of prevention? Why the secrecy on all the various security plans? We can also mention the role and the powers of the various trade unions, elected officials, sometimes in cross-border or even global risks. The pandemic can be used as a current example.
Thank you very much, Angelina. One of you would like to take the floor first? Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Yes, just to challenge this thing of we need the police, I don't think we do. And I think there are lots of people, especially people who have suffered at the hands of the police, who would agree. And I think actually our challenge is to envisage what would society look like without the police? What would the society look like without a militarized border system? There's studies on how much governments spend on maintaining the militarization of borders and the detention and deportation structures. So it's like actually it's a lot less money to regularize people and integrate into society. And I think, we cannot minimalize the violence that particularly black and brown bodies experience at the hands of the police. We look at, domestic violence and violence against women and the trauma that comes from interacting with the police and the criminal justice system after experiencing the violence. So I really, feel like we need to be bolder in the society we want, and there are examples happening around the world that maybe we need to share and draw inspiration from. And also we've been talking a lot about security and violence at a national and international level, but I'd also like to challenge us to look at how we are replicating that violence in the movements and groups that we're part of. And how, as movements and organizations and groups, we need to be doing the work to deconstruct the structural oppressions that we are inevitably replicating, and how we've internalized from values from capitalism, such as productivity, efficiency, output, constant growth. And we need to make sure that it's not, marginalized folk or always women or people of color who are having to do that work for the organizations. And again, talking about action and concrete steps. So we don't stay at the rhetoric. There's a lot that organizations can be doing in terms of looking at who has power in the organization, how are staff actually treated, what are your parental rights like, what is your pay discrepancy, whose work is considered more valuable, who's doing the emotional labor and trying to bring about change from within, and who is most likely to burn out, who is disposable. And so, I just think with all these conversations that we're having, we need to be thinking at, every level from the international to the individual.
Yep, thank you, Sarah. So there is Walter, and I think Angelika raised her hand as well. But just to remind us also for the two questions that were in the Q&A box. One on the question on if we shouldn't rather address the root causes of conflict and not the securitization of conflict, and the question on how do we move on with the, I think, ILO statistic that was quoted, that we have more death at the workplace than at the war front, and what about workers' security, as far as I understand this question? Just to remind you that these are out there as well. So Walter and then Angelika. Your microphone is still muted. The classic, yeah, thanks. Yep.
Sorry. I don't want to oversimplify the question. And of course, the issue is complex and also depending on the situation in which we are in. After the terrorist attack in Vienna, it was difficult to make a point. But now, weeks later, things turn out in a different way. Today, in the Austrian newspapers, appeared a story of an assault on a mosque where the perpetrator was revealed being an agent of the security services. And the problem in all this is that there is a system which includes the penetration of state apparatuses, police apparatuses and secret services by the far right. And we must have the stamina to talk on this. And we must have the stamina to talk on fundamental truth. What do you expect? You wage a war in Libya, you destroy the state. You wage a war in Syria, you interfere. You send drones to a dozen of countries killing people. You protect the siege of the Palestinian peoples in Gaza. What do you expect would be the repercussion on their own society? It's absolutely unrealistic that people believe that they have nothing to do with all that. And I'm afraid the left must talk on these issues. And the left must talk on the fact that you cannot humiliate for tens of years 10% of your population without provoking irrational, criminal, bad repercussions. And that is the core of the problem. Of course, there is police needed, but in the first place, a different way of organizing the living together of communities in our societies must take place, and we must change the external political strategies and attitudes of the European Union and of our countries. And the problem is, and that is what Kat mentioned, what do you say to a journalist? I think we must be aware that meanwhile, we are deprived of our language. We can't breathe. We can't breathe because in this climate of violence, of marginalizing, solidaristic, pacifistic discourses, it becomes ever more difficult to give rational explanations of what happens. And I understand that this also differs from country to country, because in a country where you are part of the government, you have to provide safety, you have to provide protections, and whatever happens in your country, you will be held responsible. But this is only part of the question. The other part of the question is we have to develop our own language for describing freedom, dignity, and social justice. And if we start narrowing ourselves, always taking the little space which is left to us in order to allow another piece of the liberal and the radical left to join, so to say, the mainstream discourse, we end up in being annihilated as a cultural and a moral force. That's why I'm so I would say, passionately in saying that the first step we ought to take is to defend our language, which is a language of truth, which corresponds, by the way, also to emotions, because that what emotionally is perceived by people, in many cases depends on the movement, on the practice in which they are involved. And for this reason, I'm not so pessimistic as it seems that I am, because we saw these wonderful Black Lives Matter demonstrations all over Europe, and we saw a creativity. It was so wonderful reading the slogans of these people, hearing them chanting and singing. I mean, this spontaneous expression of democracy and culture that should us give the conviction that if we are fighting the right cause and if we are speaking the truth, we have the possibility to connect with the best parts of our societies and expand our political and cultural space.
Great. Thanks a lot for this, Walter. Angelika, you're next.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to address the question of, shouldn't the question rather be how to address the root causes of conflict and not the securitization of conflict that was asked in the chat. And I think we really have to address both, of course, but I think also the reason, so a lot of problems that we have mentioned today are an outcome and an effect of the securitization. So there is violence at the hands of police and military at the borders and in the countries. There's mass surveillance, there's racially motivated violence and profiling and discrimination, and the list goes on. There's prisons that don't work, that over sentence people, and so, and all these are linked to I think what we call the securitization, and that's why we do need to talk about that. And these are all, or a lot of this is a violation of international law or of fundamental rights or of just general principles of solidarity and free and good life. So I think we do have to talk about both, but of course that's sort of the difficult part, that we have conflicts that also we deem real, and then we have answers that are not only not answers of to those problems, but also they create more problems. So yeah, that's just a quick question to that quick answer to that question.
I would like to ask David, because David, I'm looking at the time for you. You're going to be soon leaving us, so maybe you want to take the floor as well once before.
Okay. If Heidi don't mind, I would prefer. Thank you. I would like also to address the question because I think it's crucial. But of course, we shouldn't, but they don't, because it's not for granted. So they have a long history of interest, and something like it is something like it's not for granted. I have to go into concrete. I think it's easily to explain for me. When there was the terrorist attack in Paris, we as Podemos, we launched a manifesto of 7 points asking for peace. And peace, what does it mean, peace? So it's something like everybody could understand in easy language. We put it on Twitter, on social networks. So we're trying to have something like a plan, not talking just about police. And I agree that we need something. It's very difficult to explain for me in English, so I will try to think quickly. This kind of manifesto, trying to have something like a program, so something like the people, normal people see, okay, you have a plan. You are not talking only about structural causes, pacifism. It's something like it's not regarding to how that the people in Paris suffer. So, but we said in every TV program to our speakers, to our party people, that if we are suffering a serious problem, that is not only us. Every day in the country there is something like a terror attack, like in Paris, but in different countries that we don't even think about it, and it's just the problem because they are all related. And it's very difficult to say because these people that they are in the industrial complex and the people that they feel afraid and they are bought by these people, so they are in the side, but if we are good in linking international causes and reaction, we have a lot in gain, because it's not for granted. If we have power, and if we have power, not only at left, or with social movement, with people in the street, in the papers, so we have to push the people. And if you look into Saudi Arabia, every country in Europe is selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. It's a horrible regime. It's oppressing the people, and it's not only Saudi Arabia. There is we can address at least 10 countries that they are horrible. When we are revealing the people in our states, it's not easy to sell it this. So we can move the people in that way, but we need also I don't have to say it. I think we need something like this kind of program, so very structured, very convincingly. And I would like to return to my previous point at my first intervention, that we need to work a lot in times there are not terrorist attacks and there are not wars, trying to explain the connections, because it's easily to understand. Because when the people are in fear or suffer a loss, it's impossible to say nothing. Because I remember a very good example. I don't know, if you look into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and you talk to people from different sides, when a person suffer a loss, it's impossible. It's just a loss. If you can say, okay, it's just one loss, and the other country has 1,000. But it's something like rational in the time that is not rational. And if you look into the powerful messages, for instance, if you look into Nurit Bellet, the famous teacher, she suffered a loss of her children in a terrorist attack. She say, okay, the problem is not just the terrorist attack. We are living in a structural chaos that is unsafe for me, because we are exposed to this violence. And I don't like violence, but if we don't like violence, we need to tackle the causes. And just to regarding to Maite Ledesma, that we need to push the governments and to push the parties and the organization into doing this. And thanks a lot for everybody, and sorry to have to go. But it's very interesting, and always in like our seminars, we have different approaches, but I learned a lot. So happy to have with you.
Thank you very much, David, for taking the time. Thank you very much. We will meet again soon. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Maybe I will try to provoke you all a little bit now, if Axel allows me. Heidi wants to talk, yes? Heidi,
yeah.
I will provoke your speech. 2 years ago, I was in Italy, actually meeting with you, Heidi, in the Casa della Donne. And some weeks before that, there was an anti-abortion conference visited by all the far right and Orban and these evangelical Christians around Kurz and all this. And they had a huge poster at the conference site in Verona saying that abortion is the most frequent reason of feminicide. So there you have a clear example of how an issue is taking from them, and they're trying to portray it as a security issue for women, and we know it's structural patriarchal violence. Yes. So Heidi, maybe I give you the floor now.
Okay, I don't really feel provoked, but I share this feeling with you. And just to add a little point on this, we had in the German Parliament a discussion on agenda, women, peace and security, and the future NAP we're discussing. And there was a really good proposal by the left and another by the Green Party, Social Democrat. Everybody tried to be in a little bit on board, being very feminist, very gender open, and so on. And at the end, there was a woman from the conservative, from CDU, who said, yeah, I'm really sorry. We would have liked to have a common declaration, at least at the end, but we wanted to have just a little sentence in this text on women's rights, reminding the unborn children. And this was for me, it was nearly a shock, because this is the opposite of what is needed if we discuss on women's rights. And this was really a shame. And then, of course, the applause was coming from the very right-wing AfD, and they felt, yeah, she has said it, and all these protectors for life. It was really a shame. And coming back to what was the question of should we better talk about the root causes, I think there is no contradiction. We just have a direct line also in history from the root causes. And I mentioned this in the feminist discussion, it's always the mix of patriarchy, militarism, and economic exploitation. So here we are still, and the Istanbul Convention and the way of dealing, for example, in Poland at the moment, with the taking back the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, is such an example where we really have, on the one side, a criminal law system at the moment, built up by peace, and on the other side, this terrible influence of the church. So we have to stay clearly on the side of these women in the street, and this is part of patriarchal dominance. The second root cause with the militarism, I have the big hope that left parties in the parliaments on all different levels, also on the EU level, they really keep to the idea of disarmament and concrete disarmament. I saw it, I had some historical experiences in the Green Party, which I left already in 2000 because of deciding to go to war in the Kosovo case at this time. But this way of also slowly dismantle a clear decision that we need disarmament, which would be so logic with these overkill capacities we have all over the world. And it's not just nuclear weapons, it's also European army, which is discussed in my country as if this would be the logic further development, especially regarding the situation with the US and China and all these great threats which they bring. So I really hope that the left sticks to this clear commitment to disarmament. And the last point of these root causes is for me the economic aspects. And if I see the discussion in Germany, for example, on business and human rights and the new law of the supply chains, this is such a colonial debate coming back, and the economic dominance. This is really from the root causes of this economic exploitation to actual facts. And really the very last point is what we are faced with, these so-called frozen conflicts around us, which are not frozen nowhere. And the last one in the Caucasus with the war is really a wake-up call for international politicians to do something. They cannot just say this is a frozen conflict. For the moment, there is nothing to do. We have just to wait, and we know that for the Sahrawi people, as for in Caucasus, and in so many cases, it is the next war preparing, and we have to invest so much creativity, knowledge, and to work with this in a long-term perspective with this frozen conflict. So, and to blame Turkey for politics they are doing at the moment, it's really it's just crazy.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Now, given the time, and also I think given the really demanding discussion that we have, or I find it also intellectually quite demanding to bring all these different aspects that we're discussing together. And we have still one question in the Q&A box. I think I would formulate this now as the closing question, giving you all the opportunity to react to this before we close. And one observation that I have, and this is no surprise, because this is also how we organized our workshop series, and it's how we brought this panel here, not this panel, this roundtable together, is that we've been discussing security now on various different levels, from foreign policy. So let's say the more traditional reading of security policy, then to a very local level, talking about domestic violence, talking about the question whose security we're talking about. So thanks for everybody also in the attendees for bearing with us on that. That is also on intention, so to say, as we feel that we need to address the term security that broadly, because we have the impression that those movements that we've been mentioning already, and I'll come back to them in a second, who are opposing, or in other terms, who are affected by the use of the current security discourse and the notion of security, or that is one of their common denominators, that they're affected by the security discourse. So this is why it also for us makes sense to look at it globally, because by addressing security, that has been our impression, we address many of the problems that are addressed by many various social movements. And this also then relates to a question in the chat, and the question that has been addressed by many of you throughout our discussion, the role of social movements and the question how social movements can join forces, where we see their intersections, and if this is maybe already taking place. One aspect that I already mentioned that we discussed during our workshop, where this becomes very obvious, where security is affecting activists working on climate justice, but also those working on peace, is the extraction of fossil fuels in the Mediterranean. And there we see efforts for climate activists and peace activists to join forces to tackle these developments. So this, as I said, also has been a question raised in the chat, which is how do social movements change the narrative? Are there actions and steps already being done? And at what levels in order to initiate this process of crafting a new narrative? And I'm thankful for this question, because this is also something we've been thinking about during our series. And I think which is also a good closing question to look ahead and also take up the calls we heard during our debate on mobilizing and the question of mass movements on this. So whoever would like to go first, or if Katerina wants to add anything to that.
Yes, I would like to add something, and I think I want to choose the next speaker. I think I want to hear from Walter first in my power position as a moderator. But I would like to take it a little bit back. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about reviving the peace movement. We had already also controversial discussion during our workshops, the old peace movement and the new peace movement and the other peace movement and so on and so on. De facto, the peace movement in around 2000, against the war on Iraq was quite strong, and actually the left, the parties, the political structures of the left benefited of this movement structurally, and it also ended up with a lot of controversy and a lot of mobilization afterwards. But right now, everybody's looking for this kind of mass mobilization where we can all find together again. So perhaps, Walter, you have some ideas, or maybe you can guide us a little bit towards the problems. Where is the peace movement?
Well, I participated in two waves, big waves of the peace movement. One was in the 80s, and the other one was what you were referring to. I think it was in 2003 when the Global Day of Action was called by the World Social Forum against the war in Iraq. And I believe that it is not possible, so to say, to create a mass movement artificially or through the will of the central, most dedicated actors. There must be a number of factors coming together, and particularly, I think it must be a broad sense of understanding what in a given historical moment is at stake. And I believe that to a large extent, in the broader left, including the social movements, including the political parties, there still is an underestimation of the perils in which we are in. I wonder what would the governments call for that the population does in case of a nuclear attack. They would call the population to stay at home. That's what we are actually doing at the moment. I say this because I think we must not ignore there's a huge threat of our livelihood is represented by the arms race. And behind of this are competing imperialisms of global and regional powers, which aim at making wars feasible, limitable, and winnable in order to have them available for their strategic ends. And to cope with this danger, namely that a part of the elites seriously considers the possibility of wars in different parts of the world, to take this seriously is one of the huge targets of the social movement of the left. And sometimes this appears to be so abstract, but if you were 20 years ago in Syria, in Damascus, or if you were 20 years, 25 years ago in Libya, these were repressive states, but anyway, peaceful societies, and nobody would expect within a period of a couple of years that these societies would turn into war zone. And this can happen everywhere, unless we have broad conviction of the societies that war and the preparation of war never can be a reasonable means to achieve any political goal. And I think to cope with this is hugely political. It requires a political agenda encompassing disarmament. And I'm fully with Heidi, we must be strict with our parties and our party leaders that they must never succumb to the idea of participating for cheap tactical advantages in this logic of arms race. It's about strengthening of international law, reform the United Nations. It's about the revision of the trade agreements, the redefinition of the EU rose in the international arena, the decoupling of the European states from NATO, the repudiation of transforming the EU into an autonomous imperialist power, and so on and so forth. But this is a political agenda which we must address, and we, as Transform, as a political foundation, have to create the intellectual tools for this. I do not use the term of a narrative for describing this, because I think it's about analysis, it's about understanding the real interaction of different forces, the conflict lines to which we have to relate, the forces with which we can ally, may it be the Catholic Church, may it be the social movements, may it be political parties. I think that all requires research and analysis, and at the same time an openness to create commonality with everybody who would be available in this struggle for a peaceful world, which creates the precondition for the change of the world into a better future.
Thank you, Walter. Which one of you would like to go first? Sarah, Angelika, Heidi? I think Angelika or Sarah, perhaps? Angelika or Sarah? Sarah, okay. Sarah is ready. So, take it.
I think
So,
Angelika.
Okay, come on.
I don't know. I'm sorry.
Yeah, let's start with you.
I still wanted to touch upon your provocation from before, if I can, the abortion, feminicide. So I think what they do there, and I think that happens very often, that you come into a sort of field of counting lives, and I think that's always super tricky in general. And it also becomes very hard to navigate when it becomes clearer, if you look a bit deeper, that, as I think Sarah has already said, lives are not counted the same way. So it's not actually about the number of lives, but it's about which lives. So in that case, the life and the decision of the mother is counted more than something that other people wouldn't even call life, because it's not even a living thing yet. And then you also count, you give much more importance to lives lost in terrorist attacks and life lost at borders and during migration. You then have a kind of weird count of sometimes of lives lost during the pandemic. We have today had a right-wing politician in the news saying to the like, we have a very high toll of deaths of corona in Austria at the moment, just for the context of those that we're doing really bad. And this politician just said, well, death is just a part of life. And then imagine that from a law and order politician to say that in any other context, and in something that they don't want to deal with and find kind of opportunistic to not address as an actual problem, and then you just say something like that. So I think, and in that sense, I also want to go to a narrative that I find, the more I think of it, extremely well, and we've mentioned it many times today, but Black Lives Matter it really addresses that. It doesn't say security for Black people, which it could also arguably mean, but it says these are lives that matter no matter what. And it seems very, I mean, to someone who believed that before, it seems kind of very obvious and also a bit simple and not very radical. But if you think of it in a way, or in a debate where this really isn't, like it's not thought like that, then it becomes something really important to say. And the way it's been disputed with, say, all lives matter and whatnot, it becomes really important. And to like end this, I want to bring an example of a seminar I held, and I found that shocking. This was a seminar for young people, not in a progressive leftist context, and I wanted to make this point, by showing and comparing numbers of deaths. And I thought this was a good idea to show so many people have died in Europe in the past years by terrorist attacks, not that many, and so many people have died in the Mediterranean trying to cross, many more. And then I asked them, what does this tell you about security and about how security is debated? And they said, well, one is not a security issue because this didn't happen in Europe, so it's not a security issue. And they also chose to board those to board those ships. And I was like, I really couldn't believe it. I thought they hadn't understood, and they were like, no, that's not an issue that we think Europe has. So it's like, wow, if that's really, there's no counting you can do if the basis is not there to talk about lives or anything. So I think you will always have to go much deeper in any sort of debate like that. Yeah. And I was very mistaken in that instance to even bring this as an example, because I hadn't even preempted how, where I would have had to start on this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Angelika, for this very concrete example as well. That's always very helpful. Sarah or Heidi, who wants to go next? I think Sarah, yeah, or no, Sarah, yeah.
So yeah, I think when we're talking about the root causes of conflict, I absolutely agree, and I think ultimately it comes down to this colonial capitalist system we have in place, and how militarism and the arms industry is the force that keeps it there. And obviously I agree that European states have to stop arming countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey and Mexico, but we need to deal with the violence and repression that's happening, in our countries too. And it's not always about looking elsewhere, but actually exposing the hypocrisy of countries like the UK, for example, who talk about human rights. And it's like, as long as we have 40,000 people dying in the Mediterranean trying to reach Europe, or the Canary Islands becoming a new Moria camp, or for example this week in Belgium we have the trial of a police officer who shot and murdered Mauda Shouri, a 2-year-old Kurdish refugee, people in detention centres, people being beaten and murdered by the police. We can't talk about human rights, and there are so many examples. For example, tear gas is a chemical weapon which is banned in war, and yet it's used by police against people protesting the violence and injustice of the system they live in. We've got Europe negotiating a new free trade agreement with Mercosur, which is driving the industrial model of agriculture that is destroying the planet and displacing communities. So I think my biggest thing is really, when we talk about these issues, it's having this holistic intersectional analysis, and it's not just words but how we put that in practice. And just to finish, it's interesting that you talk about the Iraq war, which I think, as you say, it's often talked about, this big moment in the peace movement, but actually what we should talk about is you had over 30 million people mobilizing, and yet countries still went to war. And how about the disempowerment that came from that, and the disillusionment in the process, in that, what does it take to actually change government action? I felt the same after the 2009 climate talks in Copenhagen. The climate movement, we'd put all this energy into a process and nothing happens. And I think, again, coming back to Jane McAlevey, to end on a positive, she talks about the difference between advocacy, mobilizing and organizing. And I think NGOs particularly get stuck in advocacy. The movements that I've been part of, we tend to get stuck on mobilizing, turning out to direct action, having, media coverage and lots of social media shares. But ultimately, what we need is deep organizing. And we look at what the Gilets jaunes did in France. We look at the huge strikes that have happened in the US in teaching and healthcare, and we look at the role that boycotts and strikes played in the civil rights movement in the US, and I feel like that is the way to go.
So Heidi, the floor is yours before we close the session.
I think that there are many ways to go, and what Sarah now mentioned, this strike movement and boycott movement, and so on, they are really important. And I think when Walter spoke about the intellectual tools coming from Transform, and I really love already the name of Transform, because this is the issue where we have to go and where we have to participate. For me, the question of participation was for a long time was clear. We need 50% of women in all these debates, and we know that sustainable peace agreements can only be concluded if there are women in the negotiations meaningfully, and also long-term strategies and so on. But on the other side, this is the difficulty in participation is that on all levels we have to say also to learn to say no, because this I had the experience in the framework of our association on UN Resolution 1325, and I was proposing a seminar against the militarization of the Sahel, because we had a conference in Africa, and I wanted to take this up, comparing the real needs of the women in Northern Africa and the militarization. And the women from the foreign ministry told me, sorry, why should we finance an idea where you are criticizing us? So this is a kind of, it looks cynical, but this was the argument, and and so all the rhetoric around civil society and the big importance does not really play a role in implementing then this civil society participation, or and from the top they are choosing, for example, women from African Women's Leaders Network, or they create a wonderful network with wonderful women from Unidas, with women from Mexico, and so on. This is not the level where really changes happen. And this makes it so difficult, but resistance and resilience is something which we have to train. And we need, for this, we need a counterpart also on the political level, as NGOs and international organizations, at least to have an entry point to bring our political ideas into the political discourse. And this is where we have we need a constant training and solidarity, and see that we are not alone to fight for this. And this is where I would really thank you for the organizing these kind of debates, to strengthen also us who are so convinced that we are on the right side of the Thank you.
Axel, I'm waiting for you. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much for these closing words, Heidi. So now it's 8 o'clock, and we'll officially call this a day. Thank you very much for this really engaging discussion. Big thank you to our speakers for staying with us 2 hours in this format, which is, I think, quite demanding. So a big thank you for that. Yeah, I think we've really seen the complexity of the issue we're discussing, but thank you for very clear statements. that we'll definitely take with us for the next steps that will follow, and for making this this topic approachable nonetheless. A big thank you as well to our interpreters, and to those from the European Forum, to the organizers of the European Forum, who've been also with us tonight. Thanks a lot, Angelina, for taking care of the chat. I hope I'm not forgetting anyone here now. Okay. Yes, Walter?
No, I think you thanked everybody. I
Right.
think Axel just unmuted himself. Yes, we will continue anyway, Axel and I working in that topic, and we will be very happy to continue these discussions with you in open formats, but also in more private formats. And thanks again for taking the time, all of you. Bye-bye. We can stop the stream now.